I woke up at 5 a.m. to the sound of construction equipment on my property, and when I looked out my bedroom window, there was a brand new chain-link fence cutting straight through my pasture where my cattle graze. The fence had a shiny new sign reading, "Private Property, Willowbrook HOA" attached to it. And standing next to a white pickup truck was Stephanie Walsh in her power suit, clipboard in hand, supervising like she owned the place. What she didn't know was that I'd spent 15 years as a Texas Ranger before retiring to this ranch. And I'd dealt with plenty of land grabbers who thought a badge and paperwork could override property law. By sunset that same day, that fence would be gone. And Stephanie Walsh would learn why you never try to steal from someone who knows exactly how to fight back. My name is Marcus Stone, and I've been working this 800-acre spread in East Texas for the past 3 years since I hung up my ranger badge and decided to raise cattle instead of chasing criminals. The land has been in my family since the 1950s. When my grandfather bought it with money he saved from working oil rigs in West Texas. Every morning, I walk out onto my front porch wearing my faded blue work shirt and tan jacket, coffee cup in hand, looking out over rolling pastures where 300 head of Black Angus cattle graze peacefully under the wide Texas sky. This isn't some gentleman's hobby ranch for weekend warriors who want to play cowboy. This is a working operation that supplies beef to restaurants and grocery stores across 3 counties. And every acre of it has been legally documented, surveyed, and protected by property deeds that go back 70 years. The trouble started about 6 months ago when developers broke ground on Willowbrook Estates, a 150-home subdivision built right up against my eastern property line. The marketing materials promised luxury country living with modern conveniences, which I translated as expensive houses for city folks who want to play rural without understanding what that actually means. I didn't have any problem with new neighbors, as long as they understood that cattle ranching involves early morning activity, occasional equipment noise, and the natural smells that come with raising livestock. The development was built on land that had been sold by the Parker family, longtime neighbors who decided to cash out and move to Florida when old age made farming too difficult for them to manage. For the first few months, everything was peaceful enough. New residents moved in gradually, mostly young families and professionals who commuted to Tyler or Longview for work, and they seemed to appreciate the rural setting that had drawn them to the area. I made it a point to introduce myself to neighbors when I saw them, explaining my operation and letting them know they were welcome to stop by if they had questions about ranch life or wanted to buy beef directly from the source. Most folks were friendly and curious, asking about the cattle and enjoying the authentic country atmosphere that had been part of their decision to move out here in the first place. That changed when Stephanie Walsh moved into 1247 Willowbrook Circle and immediately began what she called community improvement initiatives. Stephanie was a 34-year-old divorced real estate agent from Dallas who'd apparently decided that managing a homeowners association would be her new career path after her marriage fell apart, and her sales numbers started declining. She had perfectly styled blonde hair that looked like it required daily maintenance, wore business suits to neighborhood events like she was running for political office, and carried herself with the kind of artificial confidence that comes from reading self-help books about personal branding and leadership presence. Within 2 months of moving in, Stephanie had gotten herself elected HOA president by promising to protect property values and maintain community standards that preserve our investment in quality living. She organized monthly meetings that felt more like corporate presentations than neighborhood discussions, complete with PowerPoint slides about property maintenance requirements and community aesthetic guidelines. Her first official act was to hire a management company that specialized in enforcement services, which translated to professional busybodies who drove around looking for violations and sending out official-looking violation notices for things like mailbox color consistency and approved landscaping materials. The first time Stephanie and I had a direct conversation was at Thompson's feed store, where I'd been buying supplies for 30 years and knew every employee by name. I was loading salt blocks into my truck when she approached me, wearing a bright red blazer and carrying that ever-present clipboard that had become her signature accessory. "Mr. Stone," she said in a voice that was trying to sound friendly but came across as condescending. "I'm Stephanie Walsh, president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. I was hoping we could discuss some concerns our residents have been raising about your operation." The way she emphasized concerns made it sound like my cattle were personally insulting her property values, and her smile had that fake quality that immediately puts honest people on guard. I set down my salt block and gave her my full attention, because 15 years of law enforcement had taught me to recognize when someone was preparing to cause trouble. "What kind of concerns?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral while my mind started cataloging everything I knew about property law and agricultural protection statutes. "Well," Stephanie began, consulting her clipboard like she was reading from legal documents, "several families have complained about odors from your livestock operation that are affecting their enjoyment of their outdoor spaces. We've also had reports about noise from your equipment during early morning hours that are disturbing residents who are trying to sleep. Most importantly, there are concerns about the impact on property values when potential buyers see industrial agricultural activity so close to a luxury residential development." I looked at this woman standing there in her corporate costume, trying to lecture me about land use in a rural area where agriculture had been the primary economic activity for over a century. "Ma'am," I replied, keeping my voice respectful but firm, "this ranch has been operating continuously since 1952, long before your development existed. We've got legal protections under Texas agricultural law that specifically prevent exactly this kind of interference from residential developments." Stephanie's smile got tighter, and she made a note on her clipboard like she was documenting evidence for some future legal proceeding. "Mr. Stone, I understand you believe you have certain rights, but property law has evolved significantly since the 1950s. Environmental regulations, zoning requirements, and community standards have all changed to reflect modern needs and expectations. I'd encourage you to research current statutes before assuming that old documents still provide the protections you think they do." The conversation ended with polite but tense exchanges about researching legal requirements and being good neighbors. But I could tell this wasn't going to be resolved through friendly discussion. Stephanie Walsh had clearly decided that my ranch was incompatible with her vision for Willowbrook Estates, and she was planning to use whatever authority she could manufacture to force changes that would benefit her community at my expense. That evening, I called my old partner from the Rangers, Jim Martinez, who'd left law enforcement to become a property attorney specializing in agricultural legal issues. "Marcus," he said after I explained the situation, "you need to document everything. HOA activists like this woman often start with complaints and escalate to legal harassment when they don't get their way. Make sure your property surveys are current, your agricultural exemptions are properly filed, and all your operations are in full compliance with county regulations." Jim's advice proved prophetic because within a week, I started receiving official-looking letters from something called Willowbrook Community Standards Enforcement, demanding immediate compliance with noise ordinances, environmental impact assessments, and livestock management protocols that didn't actually exist in county law. The letters were professionally formatted with legal-sounding language about protecting residential property values and ensuring community safety standards, but they referenced regulations that were either completely fabricated or misrepresented existing laws that didn't apply to agricultural operations. The escalation accelerated when Stephanie organized what she called a community safety forum to address the ongoing problems caused by incompatible land use in the area. The meeting was held at the Willowbrook Clubhouse, and she'd managed to pack the room with about 40 residents who'd been fed a steady diet of complaints about my ranch through social media posts and neighborhood newsletters. I attended as an invited guest, curious to see how she'd present her case to an audience that didn't understand the legal and historical context of rural property rights. Stephanie's presentation was a masterclass in manipulating public opinion through fear and misinformation. She'd prepared professional-looking slides with photos of my cattle, dramatic close-ups of farm equipment, and artistic shots of my barn that she'd apparently taken while trespassing on my property to gather evidence. Her narrative painted my ranch as an industrial operation that was threatening the health and safety of innocent families who'd invested their life savings in what they thought would be a peaceful residential community. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced from behind a podium like she was addressing the United Nations, "we're facing a situation where one individual's commercial interests are being prioritized over the rights and welfare of 150 families who chose Willowbrook Estates specifically because they were promised a safe, clean, family-oriented environment." The audience reaction was exactly what she'd hoped for. Parents started talking about their children's health. Elderly residents expressed concerns about air quality, and several families mentioned that they were already seeing declining property values because of the agricultural activity next door. By the time Stephanie finished her presentation, she'd successfully transformed my legitimate ranching operation into a public menace that threatened everything her neighbors cared about. When she offered me the opportunity to respond, I stood up wearing my practical work clothes and faced a room full of people who'd been convinced I was their enemy. "Folks," I said, keeping my voice calm and respectful, "I appreciate the chance to address your concerns. This ranch has been operating continuously for over 70 years, and it's provided economic benefits to this community long before Willowbrook Estates existed. We follow all applicable regulations, maintain the highest standards of animal care, and contribute significantly to the local tax base that funds schools, roads, and emergency services." I explained the legal protections that agricultural operations enjoy under Texas law, the grandfather clause provisions that protected existing land uses from future residential development, and the economic importance of preserving rural agricultural activity in areas that were facing increasing development pressure. But I could see that most of the audience had already made up their minds based on Stephanie's emotional presentation, and facts about property law weren't going to overcome fears about their children's safety and property values. The meeting ended with Stephanie announcing that the HOA would be pursuing all available legal remedies to protect the community from ongoing agricultural impacts, including petitioning the county for zoning changes, filing complaints with environmental agencies, and exploring options for legal action against operations that violated community standards. The applause she received made it clear that she'd successfully mobilized the neighborhood against me, and I was now facing an organized campaign designed to shut down my ranch through legal, harassment, and political pressure. Over the next month, I started receiving visits from county inspectors, responding to complaints about everything from water quality violations to livestock management problems. Each inspection found my operation in full compliance with all applicable regulations. But the process was time-consuming and expensive, requiring me to take time away from ranch work to deal with bureaucratic harassment that was clearly being orchestrated by Stephanie's campaign. The psychological pressure was significant because I'd moved to this ranch specifically to escape the stress and conflict that had defined my law enforcement career. After 15 years of dealing with criminals and dangerous situations, I'd been looking forward to peaceful rural life, where the biggest problems involved cattle prices and weather patterns. Now I was dealing with legal threats, community hostility, and systematic harassment from neighbors who should have been allies in preserving the rural character that had attracted them to the area in the first place. The situation reached a crisis point when I discovered that Stephanie had been spreading false information about my background, telling neighbors that I was a dangerous former cop with anger management issues who might pose a physical threat to families in the community. The rumors were specifically designed to make people afraid of direct confrontation while building support for official action through HOA channels and county authorities. That's when I decided to stop playing defense and start investigating exactly what legal authority Stephanie Walsh actually had to interfere with my property rights. Using contacts I'd developed during my law enforcement career, I started researching the Willowbrook Estates development, the HOA's legal structure, and Stephanie's background to understand what I was really dealing with. What I discovered was both enlightening and infuriating. The original development agreement between Willowbrook Estates and the county had specifically acknowledged the existing agricultural operations on adjacent properties and included provisions protecting those operations from future interference by residential development. The Homeowners Association had no legal authority to regulate activities on properties outside their subdivision boundaries, and their community standards documents were carefully worded to avoid claiming jurisdiction over land they didn't control. More interesting was what I learned about Stephanie Walsh's history with homeowners associations and property disputes. This wasn't her first attempt to use HOA activism as a platform for controlling land use decisions that affected her personal interests. In her previous community in Dallas, she'd been involved in a lawsuit against a neighbor who operated a landscaping business from his home, and she'd been forced to pay significant damages when the court found that her harassment campaign had violated his legitimate property rights. The pattern was clear. Stephanie had a history of using manufactured community concern to pursue personal vendettas against neighbors whose activities she found objectionable. Regardless of the legal merits of her complaints, she'd moved to Willowbrook Estates, specifically because it was adjacent to my ranch, knowing that she could organize opposition to agricultural activities that were perfectly legal but incompatible with her vision of suburban living. Armed with this information, I started building my own case with the help of Jim Martinez and a private investigator who specialized in documenting harassment campaigns. We collected evidence of Stephanie's false statements, her trespassing on my property to gather photographs, and her coordination with county officials to generate frivolous complaints against my operation. The breakthrough came when we discovered that Stephanie had been misrepresenting the boundaries of her HOA's authority in communications with county agencies. She'd been filing complaints, claiming that my ranch was somehow subject to Willowbrook Estates community standards, when the actual legal documents showed that her organization had no jurisdiction over my property whatsoever. But Stephanie's most serious mistake was about to become apparent when I woke up that morning to find construction equipment on my land and a fence cutting through my pasture. As I stood on my porch looking at the crew of workers who were installing chain-link fencing with official-looking signs, I realized that she'd finally crossed the line from harassment into actual criminal activity. The fence construction was happening on a section of my property that was clearly marked with survey stakes and had been recently inspected by county officials who'd confirmed my legal boundaries. There was no possible confusion about property lines or jurisdiction. This was deliberate trespassing and destruction of agricultural property, and it was being done under the direction of someone who knew perfectly well that she had no legal authority for her actions. I walked out to where the construction crew was working, wearing my work clothes and carrying the property survey that clearly showed the fence was being built on my land. "Morning, gentlemen," I said to the crew foreman, a weathered man in his 50s who looked uncomfortable about what he was being asked to do. "I'm Marcus Stone, and this is my property you're working on. Can you show me the permits and authorization for this construction?" The foreman, whose name was Eddie Garza, immediately stopped work and pulled out a folder of documents that Stephanie had provided. "Sir, we were hired by Willowbrook HOA to install perimeter fencing according to the specifications in this work order. The lady who hired us said this was community property that needed to be secured for safety reasons. I examined the work order, which was on official Willowbrook Estates letterhead and signed by Stephanie Walsh as HOA president. The document claimed authority to install security fencing on community perimeter areas to protect residents from livestock hazards and unauthorized access, but it didn't include any property surveys, legal description, or permits that would be required for construction on private property. Eddie, I said, showing him my property survey, this fence is being built about 50 feet inside my property line. Your client doesn't own this land and doesn't have authority to construct anything on it. I'm going to have to ask you to stop work immediately and remove any materials you've installed. Eddie looked at the survey, compared it to his work order, and immediately understood that he'd been hired to build a fence on someone else's property without proper authorization. Jesus, he muttered. That woman told us this was all approved by the county and that we didn't need to worry about property lines because it was community improvement work. The construction crew packed up their equipment within 30 minutes, leaving behind about 100 feet of chain link fence that had already been installed, along with concrete footings and metal posts that would have to be removed. Eddie apologized for the confusion and promised to document exactly what had happened in case there were legal consequences for the unauthorized construction. As soon as the crew left, I called the county sheriff's office to report criminal trespassing and destruction of agricultural property. Sheriff's Deputy Maria Santos arrived within an hour to document the scene and take my statement about what had occurred. Deputy Santos was a 15-year veteran who understood property law and recognized immediately that this was a serious criminal matter rather than a simple neighbor dispute. Mr. Stone, she said, while photographing the unauthorized fence construction, this is clearly criminal trespass with intent to damage agricultural property. The fact that it was done with heavy equipment and permanent construction materials makes it a felony under Texas property law. We'll need to document everything thoroughly because this could result in significant criminal charges. While Deputy Santos was completing her investigation, Stephanie Walsh arrived at the scene in her white SUV, apparently having been notified by the construction crew that their work had been stopped. She was wearing another one of her business suits and carrying her clipboard, clearly intending to assert her authority over what she considered to be legitimate HOA activity on community property. Officer, Stephanie announced as she approached Deputy Santos, I'm Stephanie Walsh, president of Willowbrook Estates HOA. There's been a misunderstanding about this fencing project, which was authorized by our Community Standards Committee to address safety concerns raised by multiple residents. Deputy Santos looked at Stephanie with the expression of someone who dealt with enough criminals to recognize amateur hour when she saw it. Ma'am, you've just admitted to ordering construction on private property without the owner's permission. That's criminal trespass and destruction of agricultural property, both of which are felonies in Texas. The color drained from Stephanie's face as she realized that her attempt to assert authority had just resulted in a confession to serious criminal activity, but this is community perimeter area. She protested weakly. We have a right to secure our property boundaries to protect residents from livestock hazards. Ma'am, Deputy Santos replied, consulting the property survey. This fence was built 50 feet inside Mr. Stone's property line, on land that's clearly marked and legally documented as private agricultural property. Your HOA has no jurisdiction over this land and no authority to construct anything on it. Stephanie tried to argue that there had been confusion about property boundaries and that her intentions were legitimate. But Deputy Santos was documenting statements that would be used in criminal prosecution within an hour. Stephanie Walsh was facing charges for criminal trespass, destruction of agricultural property, and conspiracy to commit property fraud. That evening, I called Eddie Garza and offered to pay his crew double overtime to return the next morning and completely remove all traces of the unauthorized fence construction. Mr. Stone, Eddie said, after what happened today, I'll do that work for free. That woman lied to us about having authorization, and she could have gotten my entire crew arrested for criminal trespass. We'll be out there at dawn to clean up this mess." By sunrise the next morning, Eddie's crew was back on my property with equipment to remove the fence posts, concrete footings, and chain link materials that had been installed the previous day. The work took most of the morning, but by noon, there was no trace of Stephanie's attempted land grab except for some disturbed soil that would be invisible within a few weeks. While the fence removal was happening, I noticed several Willowbrook Estates residents gathering at their property line to watch the proceedings. Some looked confused about what was happening, but others appeared to be understanding for the first time that their HOA president had been lying to them about her authority and legal rights. Carol Henderson, a retired teacher who lived in the house closest to my property line, approached me while Eddie's crew was finishing their work. "Mr. Stone," she said, looking embarrassed, "I owe you an apology. Stephanie told us that you'd been violating county regulations and that the fence was being built to protect our community from legal liability. I had no idea she was talking about building on your property without permission." Over the next few hours, several other neighbors stopped by to apologize and ask questions about what had really been happening with the HOA's campaign against my ranch. As people learned the truth about property boundaries and legal authority, they began to understand that they'd been manipulated by someone who'd been using manufactured crisis to pursue a personal agenda against me. The criminal charges against Stephanie Walsh moved quickly through the legal system because the evidence was overwhelming, and her confession to Deputy Santos had been clearly documented. Her defense attorney tried to argue that she'd made an honest mistake about property boundaries, but the investigation revealed that she'd deliberately ignored survey information and county records that clearly showed the fence construction was on my property. More damaging to her defense was the discovery that she'd been planning this action for weeks, including consultations with the construction company about ways to make the fence installation appear legal and authorized. Email evidence showed that she'd known perfectly well that she was ordering construction on someone else's property, and she'd instructed the crew to work quickly before anyone could challenge her authority. The financial consequences for Stephanie were severe. In addition to criminal fines and court costs, she was required to pay full restitution for the damage to my agricultural property, the cost of removing the unauthorized construction, and compensation for the disruption to my ranching operations. The total came to over $15. Ling, which represented a significant portion of her annual income, but the legal consequences were less important than the social and political fallout within Willowbrook Estates. As residents learned about Stephanie's criminal behavior and her pattern of lying about legal authority, they began to question everything she'd told them about my ranch and agricultural operations. The community that she'd tried to organize against me turned against her instead, demanding her resignation and a complete review of all HOA actions taken under her leadership. The emergency HOA meeting called to address Stephanie's criminal charges was the largest in Willowbrook Estates history, with over 100 residents attending to express their outrage about being deceived and manipulated. Several families who'd supported her campaign against my ranch publicly apologized and acknowledged that they'd been misled about the legal and factual basis for her complaints. I trusted Stephanie when she told us that Mr. Stone was violating county regulations and threatening our property values, said David Kim, a software engineer who'd signed petitions supporting legal action against my ranch. If I'd known she was lying about having evidence and legal authority, I never would have gotten involved in her campaign. The vote to remove Stephanie from her HOA presidency was unanimous, and the new board's first official action was to issue a formal apology to me for the harassment and legal troubles their former president had caused. They also voted to establish new oversight procedures to prevent future abuse of HOA authority and to ensure that all board actions would be based on accurate legal information rather than personal agendas. Stephanie Walsh's reputation in the community was completely destroyed, and she became a social pariah among neighbors who felt betrayed by her dishonesty and criminal behavior. Within 3 months of the fence incident, she'd put her house on the market and left Willowbrook Estates permanently. Unable to rebuild her credibility after the exposure of her lies and harassment campaign, the aftermath of Stephanie's downfall created an opportunity for genuine reconciliation between my ranch and the Willowbrook Estates community. The new HOA leadership organized tours of my operation for interested residents, helping them understand the agricultural activities that had concerned them and see for themselves that my ranch was a responsible operation that posed no threat to their community. Several families became regular customers for my grass-fed beef, and their children started visiting the ranch to learn about cattle care and agricultural practices. The hostile relationship that Stephanie had manufactured was replaced by cooperation and mutual respect between neighbors who'd learned to appreciate each other's different lifestyles and property. 6 months after I tore down Stephanie Walsh's fence, Willowbrook Estates held its first annual community barbecue in the pasture behind my main barn, with families from the subdivision joining ranch hands and local farmers for an evening of music, food, and genuine neighborly fellowship. The event raised money for the county's agricultural education program and strengthened relationships between suburban residents and the rural community that surrounded them. As I stood on my front porch that evening, watching the lights from the barbecue and listening to children laughing as they learned to feed cattle, I reflected on how much had changed since that morning when I'd woken up to find unauthorized construction on my property. Stephanie Walsh's attempt to steal my land had ultimately brought the community together in ways that peaceful coexistence never could have achieved. The lesson wasn't complicated. When someone tries to use fake authority to violate your property rights, the solution is real authority, backed by accurate legal information and professional law enforcement. Criminal behavior disguised as community leadership can't survive contact with actual investigation and prosecution. Sometimes the best way to defend your land is to let criminals expose themselves through their own illegal actions. Then use the legal system to deliver appropriate consequences. The real vindication came 6 weeks later when I received a phone call from District Attorney Rebecca Martinez, Jim's cousin, who'd been following the Stephanie Walsh case with interest that went beyond simple criminal prosecution. "Marcus," she said, "we've discovered that your situation isn't isolated. Walsh's criminal activities appear to be part of a larger pattern of HOA fraud that's been affecting rural properties throughout East Texas." The investigation that followed revealed a network of HOA activists who'd been using similar tactics to pressure agricultural property owners into selling their land to developers at below-market prices. Stephanie Walsh wasn't just a power-hungry neighbor who'd gotten carried away with fake authority. She was part of an organized scheme that targeted established agricultural operations adjacent to new residential developments, using harassment and legal intimidation to force sales that benefited specific development companies. The pattern is always the same. District Attorney Martinez explained during our meeting at the courthouse. Someone moves into a new development next to existing agricultural property, gets elected to HOA leadership, then launches a campaign of complaints and legal challenges designed to make farming so expensive and difficult that owners eventually give up and sell. The development companies then purchase the agricultural land at reduced prices and build additional residential phases. The evidence was compelling and disturbing. Financial records showed that Stephanie had received consulting payments from Pinnacle Development Corporation, the same company that had built Willowbrook Estates, supposedly for community liaison services that weren't clearly defined in any legitimate contract. Email correspondence between Stephanie and Pinnacle executives discussed strategies for encouraging agricultural transition and facilitating land use optimization in language that was clearly designed to obscure their real intentions. More damaging was the discovery that Pinnacle had been financing similar HOA campaigns in at least 6 other East Texas communities, always targeting family farms and ranches that were adjacent to their new developments. The company had developed a sophisticated playbook for using manufactured community complaints to create legal and financial pressure that would force agricultural property owners to sell their land cheaply rather than continue fighting. Expensive harassment campaigns. Marcus, District Attorney Martinez continued. Your decision to fight back instead of giving in has exposed a criminal conspiracy that's been operating for over 3 years. We're talking about potential RICO charges, mail fraud, conspiracy to commit property fraud, and civil rights violations under federal agricultural protection statutes. The federal investigation that followed brought FBI agents to my ranch for detailed interviews about Stephanie's campaign and the organized nature of the harassment I'd experienced. Special Agent Sarah Chen, who specialized in agricultural fraud cases, explained that my situation was being used as a model for understanding how development companies were systematically undermining family farming operations throughout rural America. What makes your case significant, Agent Chen told me, is that you documented everything and fought back through proper legal channels instead of just giving up like most victims do. Your evidence is helping us build cases against this criminal network that could protect hundreds of other agricultural operations from similar attacks. The scope of the investigation expanded when other victims started coming forward with similar stories. The Henderson family had lost their 400-acre dairy operation near Marshall after a 2-year harassment campaign that had driven them into bankruptcy. The Rodriguez Ranch outside Tyler had been forced to sell at 60% of market value after facing manufactured environmental complaints that had cost them over $80,000 in legal fees and compliance costs. Each case followed the same pattern: new residential development adjacent to existing agricultural property, HOA activist elected on promises to address quality of life issues, systematic campaign of complaints and legal challenges, and eventual forced sale to development companies at reduced prices. The criminal network had refined their tactics over time, using increasingly sophisticated legal strategies and community organizing techniques to achieve their goals. The psychological impact on farming families had been devastating. These weren't corporate agricultural operations with teams of lawyers and unlimited resources. They were multi-generational family businesses that couldn't afford to fight expensive legal battles while maintaining their agricultural operations. Most victims had eventually concluded that selling was their only option for escaping the harassment and financial pressure. You were different. Agent Chen observed, your law enforcement background gave you the skills to recognize criminal behavior and the resources to fight back effectively. Most farmers don't have that kind of expertise, and they get overwhelmed by fake legal threats and manufactured community pressure. The federal charges against Pinnacle Development Corporation and their network of HOA conspirators were announced 6 months after the fence incident, resulting in dozens of arrests and the seizure of millions of dollars in assets obtained through fraudulent land acquisitions. Stephanie Walsh's cooperation with federal investigators earned her a reduced sentence, but she still faced 3 years in federal prison for her role in the conspiracy. The civil lawsuits that followed the criminal prosecutions provided additional vindication for victims who'd lost their agricultural operations to the development fraud scheme. The Henderson family received enough compensation to restart their dairy operation on new property, and the Rodriguez Ranch was able to repurchase their original land at the price they'd been forced to accept from Pinnacle Development. My own civil lawsuit against Pinnacle and their conspirators resulted in a settlement that covered all legal expenses, compensation for agricultural disruption, and punitive damages that reflected the deliberate nature of their criminal campaign. More importantly, the settlement included provisions requiring Pinnacle to fund agricultural protection programs and rural legal aid services that would help other farming families defend against similar attacks. The media attention that followed the federal prosecutions brought unexpected opportunities for advocacy and education about agricultural protection issues. I was invited to speak at farming conferences, rural law enforcement training sessions, and state legislative hearings about the need for stronger legal protections for family agricultural operations. The challenge? I explained to a Texas House Agriculture Committee hearing. is that most farmers don't understand they're dealing with organized criminal activity until it's too late to fight back effectively. By the time they realize the HOA complaints and legal challenges are part of a coordinated scheme, they've already spent their resources on defending against manufactured problems instead of building their case against the real criminals. The legislative response was swift and comprehensive. The Texas Agricultural Protection Act that passed the following year established criminal penalties for organized harassment of agricultural operations, created state funding for rural legal aid services, and required mandatory disclosure when development companies had financial relationships with HOA organizations adjacent to their projects. More immediately practical was the impact on Willowbrook Estates and the surrounding community. The federal investigation had revealed that Pinnacle Development had planned to build 3 additional residential phases on agricultural land they expected to acquire through their harassment campaigns. With those plans exposed and criminally prosecuted, the rural character of the area was preserved permanently. The new HOA leadership at Willowbrook Estates embraced their role as partners in rural land preservation rather than adversaries of agricultural activity. They established an agricultural education program that brought suburban children to local farms and ranches, created a farmers market that supported local agricultural businesses, and organized volunteer programs that helped elderly farmers with property maintenance and seasonal work. The transformation of community attitudes was remarkable to witness. Residents who'd been convinced that agricultural activities threatened their property values began to understand that working farms and ranches actually enhanced the rural lifestyle they'd moved to the area to enjoy. Several Willowbrook Estates families started small-scale agricultural projects on their own properties, raising chickens, growing vegetables, and keeping horses for recreation. The economic benefits of this new relationship extended throughout the county. Local restaurants started featuring locally sourced beef and produce. Agricultural tourism became a significant revenue source, and several young farming families were able to purchase land and start operations because of increased community support for agricultural activities. My ranch became something of a model for how agricultural operations and residential communities could coexist successfully. We hosted regular educational tours for school groups, offered internship programs for young people interested in agricultural careers, and developed direct sale programs that connected suburban families with locally produced food. The cattle operation itself expanded significantly as demand for grass-fed beef increased among health-conscious consumers who'd learned about our farming practices through community connections. We added 200 acres through a lease agreement with the county and increased our herd to 500 head of cattle, making the ranch one of the largest grass-fed beef operations in East Texas. The infrastructure improvements funded by the Pinnacle Development Settlement allowed us to upgrade facilities, improve pasture management, and implement sustainable farming practices that served as demonstration projects for other agricultural operations. The ranch became a teaching facility where agricultural extension agents brought farmers from throughout the region to learn about innovative practices and community engagement strategies. But the most personally satisfying development was the relationship that emerged between former law enforcement colleagues and the agricultural community. Several retired rangers and federal agents had moved to rural properties and started small farming operations, creating an informal network of people who understood both agricultural protection issues and effective law enforcement strategies. This network proved valuable when similar development fraud schemes emerged in other parts of Texas. We were able to provide early warning to targeted farming families, connect them with appropriate legal resources, and share strategies for documenting and defending against organized harassment campaigns. The criminal conspiracy that had targeted my ranch inadvertently created a powerful advocacy network for agricultural protection. The annual Willowbrook Agricultural Festival that grew out of that first barbecue became a regional event that drew thousands of visitors and generated significant revenue for local farmers and ranchers. The festival featured agricultural demonstrations, local food vendors, educational exhibits about sustainable farming, and live music that celebrated rural culture and community cooperation. Standing on my front porch 5 years after that morning, when I discovered unauthorized fence construction on my property, I could see festival preparations happening in the pasture where Stephanie Walsh had tried to install her illegal barrier. Food trucks were arriving, musicians were setting up sound equipment, and families from throughout East Texas were gathering to celebrate the agricultural heritage that criminal developers had tried to destroy. The irony was perfect. The fence that was supposed to separate my ranch from the residential community had been replaced by a festival that brought thousands of people together to appreciate exactly the kind of agricultural activity that Stephanie Walsh and her criminal conspirators had tried to eliminate. Her attempt to steal my land had created something far more valuable, a permanent alliance between rural and suburban communities based on mutual respect and shared appreciation for agricultural heritage. The lesson extended far beyond property law and criminal prosecution. When criminals try to use fake authority and manufactured community pressure to steal from honest people, the solution isn't just individual resistance. It's community education, legal accountability, and systemic reform that prevents similar attacks from succeeding in the future. Stephanie Walsh and her criminal associates had underestimated both the legal protections available to agricultural operations and the willingness of communities to reject fraud and manipulation when presented with accurate information. Their sophisticated scheme had collapsed quickly when confronted with professional law enforcement investigation and community members who chose cooperation over division. As evening approached and festival lights began illuminating the pasture where my cattle grazed peacefully among the celebrating families, I reflected on how much stronger our community had become through surviving and defeating the criminal conspiracy that had tried to destroy it. Sometimes the best way to protect what matters is to let criminals expose themselves through their own illegal actions, then use every available resource to ensure they face appropriate consequences. Justice served properly doesn't just punish wrongdoing, it creates stronger communities that can't be easily divided by future criminals who mistake honest people for easy targets. The fence came down overnight, but the community that grew up in its place would last for generations.